めたいと思います。I would like to introduce you briefly in 1 minute or so, but in Japanese. それではですね、最初に、ご紹介いたします。今日は2人のゲストを、デモンフォート大学から、フォート大学からお招きします。で、地図をですね、日本語でちょっと出しました。イギリス全部映ってませんが、右下にロンドン、オックスフォード、ストラトフォード、シェイクスピアの上に行くとチェスターがあってですね、でデモンフォート大学は、あそこ真ん中にございます。ヨークシャーはもうちょっと前の方、ヨークシャーから違う、そんな感じです。というわけで、
Oxford is here. Here.
No. Oxford here.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Stratford.
Stratford, Oxford, Stratford.
まあそれはともかく地理はともかくですね。
And this is 1 hour in the train.
1 hour?
Just 1 hour.
From London?
Well, we don't have Shinkansen, you know. Only to go to France, but nowhere else. So it's 1 hour.
あまりそういうわけで今日はお二人その大学から、お招きいたしました。リー・ランディさん最初の講演者ですが、彼はですね、ミュージック・テクノロジー&イノベーション・リサーチセンターの所長さんということでこの分野を率いています。で彼は、研究者であり、ミュージシャンでもあるんですけども、制作と、音楽学の仕事、両方やってらっしゃいます。で、同時にですね、オーガナイズサウンドという雑誌の編集長でもあり、さまざまな企画をやってらっしゃいます。で、本もいっぱい書いてまして「What's the matter with today's experimental music」とかですね「Understanding the art of sound organization」などなど、これは横の中にバイオグラフィーありますのでご覧ください。で、2003年以降ですね、EMS ということで今回は名古屋に EMS2017 が、5日から8日まで開かれます。そこにキーノートスピーカーとして、来ていらっしゃるので、サテライトでお二人をお招きしたっていうのが、いたしました。で、リー・ランディさんは、バイオには書いてないんですが、コロンビア大学で学ばれて、そしてバファローでも学位のために行かれ、その後アムステルダムで、教鞭を取り、現在はそういうわけでデモンフォート大学に行かれます。で今日は、タイトルはそこになりますように、すいません。私がですね、いろんな話が多すぎるので、もう絞ってくれと。で、組織とか学会の話じゃなくて、ご自身の話をリプレイしまして、リクエストお願いしまして、In pursuit of the innovative and accessible, some of the driving forces behind my music and my research ということで、ご自身の音楽と、マヘムにある音楽と、研究の哲学について語っていただきたいと思います。それでは、please start.
Okay. First, I want to thank Professor Osaka Naotashi for the invitation for both of us to come and visit the Japanese Society for Sonic Arts today. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I have had to wait for many years to come to Tokyo for the first time, and I'm very pleased and happy to be here with you. And I'm going to start with a very short apology as well, because for me, the sonic arts are making music with sounds, and maybe not know. Is it this? No. Oh, sorry. Okay, I need to turn this on for later, for my sound. The sonic arts is making music with sounds, and not the do-re-mi necessarily. And both John and I are artists, musicians. So for me, number one is the music, and number two is the musicology, the study of music as a humanities subject. And number 3 is the technology. Even though I study technology, I will mention this in my talk. I only develop a technology when I want to do something and there is no technology that I can use. So this time make the technology for it. And many of you are in engineering and sciences. So I wrote a talk for musicians. So I hope you find it interesting anyway. It's also, as Professor Osaka knows, very unusual for me to write a paper before I deliver it. I usually have a little card for 1 hour, and I just improvise with words. But I will read the paper because you have it. And if you are having a difficulty with the language, you can look at the paper. Sometimes I will add a few words to add some thoughts, but you can find it there. And if you find the English difficult, please feel free to stop me and interrupt. I know in Japan and many countries this is impolite, but I'm inviting you to do it if you're having difficulty following what I said. So the title I made because as a musician, much of the contemporary music has a very small public. And I'm wondering why it's such a small public. I'm going to talk about this. And so I'm pursuing being innovative or experimental as an intellectual, but as a musician, and accessible, which means that people actually want to hear the music and can enjoy the music. People sometimes think this combination is impossible, but I think it is possible. So I will read the abstract and then the paper so that you know what I'm going to talk about, because maybe you did not read the abstract before today. And this is also the structure of that's fine right there. This is also the structure of the paper. So my talk will present the motivations related to both my work as a musician and as a scholar within the world of sonic creativity, so making music with sounds, any sounds. Instead of focusing on technology and musical technique, introduce some of my ideas, all of which are intended to move music forward. These will include accessibility or inaccessibility of new music, musical communication, dramaturgy, which is a word we take from theater, and aesthetics, new musical communities, and even humor. A lot of music that is so-called art music or high music is not funny, it's serious. But I think you can laugh as well, so you'll see what you think. And looking towards the future, John Richards here, my colleague, and I are writing a book together which is almost finished, called On the Music of Sounds and the Music of Things. It will be discussed in this talk. In this book I investigate sampling culture, and John is focused on do-it-yourself or hacking culture. Together we look at what we believe are the driving forces of the innovative 21st century sonic musician. The following text has been written in the form of an informal talk. It is intended to highlight issues of potential interest to the audience and future readers because it goes online on the JSSA site. Unusually for me, it's a bit of a self-portrait, which means I'm talking about myself. Normally I do not do this when I give a talk. The autobiographical framework for it offers the opportunity to focus on subjects that I believe are of great importance to those involved in any aspect of the sonic arts. It is based on the assumption that we are all interested in the subject of music and innovation. Its structure is simple and straightforward. After an initial section running through my early career, running up to what might be called my aha moment, the second section focuses on some of my views concerning what I've called the innovative and the accessible in the title. Here, aspects of my artistic, scholarly, and pedagogical work are examined, and the talk's final section concerns two current initiatives illustrating my continuing working towards these pursuits. So we get into part one, which is called How I Came to My Key Motivations as a Musician and a Scholar. Like many in my field, I had a dual education. Let us call it arts science, in which I studied applied mathematics and computing early on, as well as music from a very young age. I therefore have degrees in both, although all of my postgraduate studies were in music. My training was traditional in the sense of composition being intended for makers of high art music. And in fact, my composition teachers at Columbia University in New York City, where I spent most of my university years of study, were generally second-generation atonalists. So these are instrumental composers making very, very dissonant music. So they made music for a relatively small public, but somehow offered the sense that they were extremely important musicians. Fortunately for me, Columbia was the first university in the United States engaging with what was then called electronic music. And it was a pleasure to work in the Columbia Princeton studios, as well as use the main computer for my first digital works at this time. I use the word pleasure half ironically, for what was expected of me aesthetically was in a very strong contrast to what I was personally listening to elsewhere in New York City, such as the works of John Cage, who was perhaps the most experimental composer of all time, and the minimalists, who were quite young when I was a student. During this period, I studied both musicology and ethnomusicology. The musicology was excellent in terms of acquiring research skills, but I also felt ill at ease about the musicologist's reluctance to engage with very new or current musical trends, because most of them felt that music needs time to find its place before one is able to study it rigorously. Ethnomusicology offered me something precious, namely the opportunity to study very many varieties of music around the world, a great number of which were totally new to me. The Japanese music forming an area that fascinated me enormously. In fact, at that time, I had a friend who came to Japan and purchased a shakuhachi for me. And I studied shakuhachi for a while at this time. I was almost 20 or 21. And now I have a huge collection of mainly Chinese, but some Japanese instruments as well. And so I know a lot about the more traditional Japanese music, but also the contemporary music, and know many, many, many Japanese composers and performers. But at this time, as a student, this Japanese music was very new to me. And so I realized that what is old to some, so the Japanese music sounds very old to you, and young people probably reject it as being from, the past. It sounds very new to people in other places in the world because they don't know it. And so it's very fresh, even though it has ancient traditions. And this awareness of these cultural differences was very important to me. It was also important to me because when I became a composer, I was aware that when I work with cultural material of any sort, it should always be treated with respect. Some people like to grab a sound like a sample, but they don't understand what its meaning is for some people, and it's just a sound to them. And I think that's incorrect. I think if it has great meaning, it should be treated with respect. Prior to completing my studies and moving permanently to Europe, I spent a PhD preparation year at Buffalo, working with Lejar and Hiller, who was the very first person to make music using a computer. I was his assistant for that year. And I worked with Morton Feldman, who was very close to John Cage, who was an old friend of mine by this time. Buffalo, New York is the second city of New York State. It's 600 kilometers away from New York City. It is a miserable place, I think. It was rich, maybe in the late 19th, early 20th century. But it was quite tired, and it's also very cold in the winter. It was very often -40. And it's very windy as well, so it's not a nice winter, I can tell you. In fact, Yanis Xenakis, I think many of you have heard of this person. When he was visiting Buffalo, he told me personally it reminded him of Moscow. And at this time, Moscow was very much the Soviet Union, and so it was quite run down as well. So that wasn't a very kind thing to say about US City, I can tell you. What made Buffalo special, however, was the music department's open-mindedness towards new experimental music, something that would inspire my attitude throughout my career. When I was 25, I moved to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, in Holland, and I commenced my career at the university there the following year. And I was pleased to discover that the appreciation of culture in Europe was much more deeply rooted than in the United States. This appreciation is unfortunately decreasing a little bit given the difficult economy we have these days globally. And of course the commercial music sector continues to gain power, which we're all aware of. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but I don't think it should only be pop music that we listen to. So the fate of folk music, maybe not in Japan, but in other countries, has almost died because of the strength of the commercial music. And it's something that I think we need to be aware of, because that's a great loss of a national heritage when you lose the music that your people made 200 years ago or 100 years ago. What began to sink in was a feeling that the contemporary music was generally marginalized in society. That means it was not known to most people. And so I know, for example, how difficult it has been throughout the years to organize a contemporary music concert in Japan, as many Japanese musicians visited me in Holland and informed me about the new music scene here. So it's difficult in many countries. Most concerts internationally are only performed one time, and many have a very small audience. The press, like the newspapers and the journals, and the broadcasters largely ignore this music. And so-called classical radio broadcasters are much more interested in composers who died long ago than ones working currently. So let's go for Mozart and forget about the contemporary composer in Japan today. I'm not happy with that situation, as you can imagine. Having lived for many years in major cultural capitals, I noticed that not all arts were suffering in the same manner. For example, the contemporary dance had a bigger public than music, although that was still relatively small. And theater had an even bigger public, and many theater pieces that were contemporary were performed many times. A consequence of this was that I was to collaborate with artists in many different media, such as dance, theater, performance art, and video, also known today as new media arts, throughout my career, which meant that I reached a very, very large audience of people who were not necessarily coming for my music. They were coming for the collaborative piece, so they came for the dance, they came for the theater piece, or whatever. the tension between the amount of new music being created and the combination of lack of opportunities to see works performed, broadcast, or recorded, and the modest public interested in it led me to what I have called an aha moment. It's like in Buddhism having a moment of enlightenment. And this is when I decided that it was important to discover why the situation of no interest in new music had evolved, and to do something about this, to improve the situation for the contemporary music. This decision was to determine the foci of my work as an artist, a scholar, and an educator from that moment onwards. And I'm talking about a moment that took place 30 years ago. So that's before some of you were born, when I realized I wanted to do these things. I was already involved with engaging a broader public in my collaborations with colleagues working in those other arts. Many of the productions were repeated dozens of times in large theaters, and some were even on the television. I received many commissions to make music and sound for productions that demonstrated that new music was indeed of interest to a big public. In many of these productions, I worked with a dramaturge who is the person who puts into words what is being communicated in a production. And if you study music, you're never asked to talk about what you're trying to communicate in your music. You're always asked, how did you make your piece? And maybe this is a mistake in the music education, to ignore communication with the public. And maybe that's part of the reason this music never was to become very popular. The ICMC talk I gave, sorry, I just made a jump. Yes, I just made a jump. Here we go. The Innovative and Accessible, a survey across my work. Although I had published on the subject earlier, the first important opportunity to discuss these issues and from my aha moment was at an ICMC in Glasgow in 1990. So that's already 27 years ago. I gave a talk entitled, "Is More Than 3 Decades of Computer Music Reaching the Public It Deserves?" Obviously, I didn't think it was. And the large hall was full, and a follow-up session was organized, so I realized more people were interested in the problem, not just me. I was already involved with engaging a broader public in the collaborations. Okay, I just told you about that. The ICMC talk was rapidly succeeded with the publication of my first book, What's the Matter with Today's Experimental Music? And from 1991, a book that indeed investigates all these questions. It accused the broadcast media of not paying attention to the music, pre-university education, so the primary school, the middle school, and secondary schools, of not introducing the music in general, and governments for not supporting the music sufficiently, and even accused the musicians themselves for not working towards audience generation, how to engage with new audience. The musicians were found guilty of for 2 reasons. Their music was potentially too difficult for a public beyond the little one that it already had, and they spent too little time supporting the success of their new music. By the way, at this time I was talking about contemporary experimental music in general, which includes instrumental music. Although at this time I personally had already opted out of working with instruments and only made music with sounds. So what you might call sonic arts or electro-acoustic music. This first book was, 2 years later, a second volume came out called Experimental Music Notebooks. And that was written for teachers and anybody who did not have access to the works, to introduce them to this music, which was a first step towards addressing a wider audience. I'll return to my own music later, But the important thing to share at this point was that these writings and my compositions throughout were focused on combining the innovative and the accessible. I'd been brought up on the term experimental music. This did not happen so much at Columbia, but instead the term was introduced by people like Lejar and Hiller, my professor, John Cage, and Pierre Schaeffer, who started electroacoustic music in 1948. Originality and discovery were thus the important forces of my music. However, but this is not a goal in itself. I wanted to avoid the arrogance of what I perceived to be the musical culture at Columbia University at this time, replacing it with forward-looking music that communicated with an audience of communities of shared interest, including the little one that already existed, which were mainly other musicians of contemporary music, and other people as well. The challenge became the framework for my research and my artistic endeavor. I'm pleased to say that I have been able to have my practice, that's making music, inform my theory, and my theory inform my music. So both sides of my work are working together. They're not separate. Not only this, both informed my teaching and educational initiatives. For example, I created a course in experimental music at the University of Amsterdam in the 1990s, a very radical project-based contemporary music course at Bretton Hall in Yorkshire, as Naotashi mentioned just now, in the United Kingdom. A curricula focused on interdisciplinary arts education, which means the students would study not just one art form, but two. They would do music and drama, or music and digital art, or this kind of combination, which most institutions don't do. They only do one thing. And then later I was to found the Music Technology and Innovation Research Center at the Montfort University that is not in a music department. It's just sonic arts. And I'm very proud of that because it's very experimental and quite unique in this way. Although this talk is not specifically about educating sonic artists, I want to make a point that I think is worthy of attention here. Namely, that one does not need a traditional musical background to thrive in our area of interest. Therefore, for example, we at De Montfort do not demand harmony and counterpoint for our incoming students. Instead, we speak of horizontal or layered composition for counterpoint and simultaneous or vertical thinking for harmony. We do not even demand music literacy, which means reading a score, of our students. Young people today, maybe they're playing popular music and they have a very good trained ear, but they have not had a traditional music education. They can probably do very well in our field without the traditional background. It's helpful to have the knowledge. It's not necessary to have the knowledge. We're also aware that we are developing different skills in sonic composition than are needed for note-based composition, although knowledge in both can be of great value. Confronting what is beneficial to students and innovating educational approaches is important to me as any other facet of my work. Before moving on, I would like to state that one does not need to restrict oneself to dealing with access. You can do top-of-the-line or cutting-edge research and thinking and composing at the same time as addressing these access issues. Although virtually all of my compositions do take opening things up to a broader public into account, my scholarly output, not least editing the journal Organized Sound, which is here, oops, I've gone too far, yeah, there's Organized Sound, and co-editing a recent book with my colleague Simon Emerson called Widening the Horizon of Electroacoustic Music Analysis, that's 2016, focus on the state of the art of research. I'll be talking to the board members of JSSA about Organized Sound later today, but just a word about this one. Many of you have heard of the Computer Music Journal. It's a very technological journal, and it's a very good journal, and it's older than Organized Sound. Organized Sound is 22 years old, and I think Computer Music is 35 or so. This journal is focused on the thinking about music using technology. And people have written for it from around the globe. I'm very proud that it's so successful. When it started, there were 4 editors, but I'm the only one now. And to do this for 22 years is like getting a present every 4 months when another one comes out, because I'm adding to the knowledge in the area. So I think that's a good thing to do. Returning to the access issue, I'd like to focus on a few of most important contributions that I would like to share with you. The first, published in 1994, is a notion called the something to hold on to factor regarding timbral composition. In this article version of a talk I gave in London in 1993, I investigated a substantial number of electroacoustic pieces in order to discover primarily musical, but also extra musical aspects that help inexperienced listeners work their way through sonic works. Many compositions that I investigated fulfilled none of the criteria that I discovered, and they were therefore probably too difficult for people to understand and to appreciate. But those that did offered navigation tools to people that were interested in opening up their work to a broader public. So it was a way of understanding work, but it was more importantly a tool for composers to reach out to listeners with their sonic works. And this something to hold on to factor article is cited very, very much in the world of sonic art. A few years later, in 2001, I embarked, initially with a PhD student, Rob Wheel, on the so-called Intention Reception Project. This project continues today, 15 or so years later, and has been used or followed up in at least 6 countries and further developed by researchers interested in its dual objectives. In brief, carefully chosen electroacoustic works, originally all including at least some, if not a great deal of identifiable source material. So when you hear the piece, you say, oh, that sounds like a glass, or a train, or a saxophone. It doesn't matter. So they could identify the source material. That these pieces were played to a variety of audiences, including a so-called benchmark group of specialists. Questionnaires about the chosen works were sent to the artists who made the pieces, and other questionnaires were used during the investigation after each of the 3 times the works were played. Each time they listened, more information about the work was shared with the listeners. So the 2 goals of the intention reception were, number 1, for inexperienced listeners, after listening to a piece that's totally new to them for the first time, they were asked whether they would like to hear this piece or a piece like this again in the future. The second goal was, for all listeners, they were asked whether being introduced to the composer's intention ideas that had been shared helped them in their listening experience. So the idea is, what's being communicated in the work? Are they hearing it, and do they find it useful to know what the musicians want to communicate? The results of this project were originally, and continue to be, fairly startling in a very positive sense. First of all, the percentage of listeners potentially interested in this music is extremely high. After Wheels and my initial testing, so this was with about 6 groups and 5 different compositions, the worst result was that 59% of the people that had gone through this experience were interested in hearing this music again, and the best case was 80%. We would have been pleased if only 20% of the listeners were potentially listening again, because in society less than 1% knows that the music exists at all. So if a majority of people are potentially interesting, that's extremely important to know. So this notion of offering something to hold on to, whether it's in terms of a program note that you get at a concert, or some information about how to listen to a work, was found to be valuable to all listeners except maybe the most experienced composers. Now, during these early years of this 21st century, Professor Osaka, the JSSA director, and I were both on the International Computer Music Association board. Now, Toshi was vice president for Asia, and I was vice president for Europe. So we saw each other at the meetings every year, in fact, at this time. A few of the board members showed some dissatisfaction with the ICMC events, as there seemed to be a big distance between the many concerts and the many technical papers. And you could always tell who was who, because the musicians had a Mac, and the engineers had a Unix computer. So even the computers that they were using usually determined who was who at the ICMC. So the complaint was basically, why was there such a distance between the technical papers and the concert? Where was the middle bit about the music that would be of interest both to the engineers and to the musicians? But for some reason, ICMC never really was able to make this bridge. It's better now than it was then. But I remember one year being invited to be the head of the jury of the papers for the music. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm very busy, I have something else at this time. They said, no, don't worry. We've received 900 papers and there's only 12 about music that you need to get refereed. So I think I proved my point when there's 12 out of 900 that's about music at a thing that's about music. So I therefore, together with Marc Battier of the Sorbonne, maybe some of you know him, he's in Japan very, very often as a musicologist, and Daniel Teruggi, who runs the Groupe de Recherche Musicale, which is the famous studio in France. The three of us have set up the Electro-Acoustic Studies, Music Studies Network, or EMS. Now, EMS has existed since 2003. And all but 2 years we've had an event somewhere in the world. The first time EMS is taking place in Japan is starting next Tuesday at Nagoya City University. Mizuno Mikako is the coordinator of this event, and she has attended this maybe 6 or 7 or 8 times. She's very, very active in this field and done fantastic work, as have others in Japan. But this is the first time the event is being held in Japan, and I'm very pleased to state there are going to be quite a few Japanese contributions this year. So what this does is, it is the bit that ICMC doesn't do. It's talking about technological music from the point of view that the music is central, and how the technology is used is very valuable knowledge to have. And what comes out of this is ideas that can be then treated by engineers to develop new technologies. So I've been directing EMS since the very beginning, so this is 14 years. Next year we'll be in Italy in June. Around this time, another initiative of mine was born called the Electro-Acoustic Resource Site, which has the abbreviation EARS. And this site was originally set up to be a glossary of terminology of the world of sonic arts. Because some of the terms are not used the same way. I'll give you a very simple example. I used the word electronic music earlier in this talk. In the US, they still use electronic music for sonic arts. But in Europe, electronic music in pop music has one definition, and electronic music for people like John and me means music where the sounds are being generated. Whether it's through instruments that John's going to talk about, or using C-sound, doesn't matter, that's electronic, yeah? So if I talk to a US American, I have to clarify, because I will say electroacoustic music or sonic arts, and they'll just say electronic music. So these different definitions are on the ear side. After getting that process done, we took the terms, of which there are about 500 terms, and we structured them into an index, which is kind of creating the structure of electroacoustic music studies, which I just talked about. But once these words were structured in the index, it was also a search engine for the bibliography of this site, which has almost 4,000 publications, which are articles and books and online in our field. So students studying this stuff can find out what's been published on this site. And there are about 20 to 25,000 visitors every month using this site. And I don't know if you can see, but UNESCO, which is the cultural part of the United Nations, adopted this project, which was a big moment for me. So this is available in, German is about to go on, it's French, Italian, Spanish, and Chinese translation is almost finished. So I'm hoping in my dreams one day you have a Japanese version of this, because of the number of people involved in this field. But I haven't found anybody to do it yet, and of course you always have to find funds, and we all know how difficult that is. But I think it would be very, very important for the people studying electroacoustic music to have ears available in your language. Somebody at UNESCO asked me a question once. Could you make this site for kids, children? And that was easy for that guy to ask. It was very hard to do. But about 10 years later, Ears 2, the picture in the middle, was born. And this is an e-learning site for people who have no experience in making music with sounds. And it's made for schools. You know, the middle school is about 11-year-old to 14-year-old children. That's the ideal age group for this site. But we've done it with kids from 8 all the way up to old people. And it has a very holistic education. You learn about theory, history, and the technology at the same time, not separately. And you have listening examples supporting what you're learning about. And you have creative assignments using a software called Compose with Sounds that is very intuitive and easy to use. So that is the tool for this e-learning environment, which has been supported by the European Union. Britain leaving the European Union is a really stupid idea. I'll tell you later, I'm in a project that has 4 million euros. You think about it. I mean, that number in yen, that's like huge. So this is just completed. There are downloadable packs for teachers to learn about this stuff so that they can teach the kids if they've never done it before. And this is going to open up all this stuff to loads of people. So I'm very proud to have worked for years. Before Ears 2 came out, I published this book called Making Music with Sounds, which is the second book I made for anybody. You have no knowledge needed to read this book. And they're fantastic illustrations that a friend has made, who's going to be at EMS, that make it really easy. So teachers at schools can use this, or people just interested. And between this and the e-learning site, you can get very, very far. But returning to more theoretical concerns, I discovered what one calls a hole in the market. Maybe you hear this expression, a hole in the market, that there's something that's not being offered that we really need. So that's a hole in the market. And I decided to write the first book about the theories in sonic arts. There was lots of history books, but no book of the theories. Or you had to read all the theories separately. So this was the first overview of the theories in the sonic arts called Understanding the Art of Sound Organization. And this book and the book to the right of that, called The Music of Sounds, which is in French and English, they appeared 1 week separate. That was a strange experience for me, because I have lots of things to do, and to have 2 books come out in 7 days is completely crazy. And in fact, that publisher, the Sorbonne, is very small, and this is at MIT. They're very big. And I wrote this book before that one, and that one came out first. So this one is the theoretical overview, and that one is giving a kind of like a manifesto. Why I think it's important that the theoretical knowledge is known. And in this book in the middle, I came up with a term, because I think electroacoustic music is, oh, it's 38 minutes already, okay. Electroacoustic music is a very difficult term for people outside. Sound-based music, music based on sounds, which is what we do. And that the information for composers and musicians, and for listeners, and for musicologists about sound-based music, it forms a paradigm. It all fits together. And so the reason for this is in the book on the right, but the concept of this was introduced in that one. Okay, so I would like to move to the other half of my brain now, the creative one, and focus on some of the items in the abstract that have not been discussed yet, and return to others in this different context, and add some sound examples to illustrate them. We all tend to rebel at one time against someone of authority in our lives, whether it's a family member, a teacher, or someone else. For me, the key rebellion was against the elitist attitudes of some of the composers I met at the Ivy League institutions in the US. Perhaps you're aware of the fact that Milton Babbitt, one of the first US electronic music composers, who worked at Princeton, wrote an article in 1958 with the title, "Who Cares If You Listen?" Which is quite arrogant. Although I realize he was not as arrogant a personality as came across here, the idea seemed to be that people should learn to understand this music, as opposed to his attempting to see how best to connect with his listeners whilst composing pieces based on his musical approach. How then can this communication be established? I assume you've already guessed that I have more or less shared this answer already. You offer listeners things to hold on to. You offer an intention-reception loop, thus considering the dramaturgy of the work, why it was made, what is to be communicated, including potential emotional responses, thinking of whom the ideal public is for this music, and perhaps adapting the music to better connect with the public when performed more than once, so make the work a little bit flexible. I'm also not at all afraid to be humorous, a human emotion usually left untouched by so-called serious music. So here follows some of the key elements of my work. Recycling, which is very important in the world today, but let's call it sampling, with found sound objects. What I call the 1% tilt. Take something from daily life and represent it within an artistic context. Surrealism. You have the Archimboldo exhibition at the Western Museum in Tokyo. That was surrealism 400 years ago. Speech, the use of speech, you'll get an example of that very soon, influenced by text sound poetry and text sound composition. Musical and cultural diversity, which is of particular interest to me. Specific sites, which means I don't just give concerts at concert halls, I'll give them anywhere. Humor and surprise, thus allowing an aha moment for the audience when they're surprised by something I've done musically. And of course, there's something to hold on to factor, a flexible artwork, and addressing different musical communities. I can remain as abstract or representational as I like it as a musician, but whatever is of relevance at a given moment, the work should be accessible to the public that is present. Does combining the innovative with accessible mean somehow simplifying my work? In my case, the answer is no. I've never intended to be obscure, at least after my aha moment, but would like to be original in the sense of discovering new things every time I compose, as well as in the sense of offering something new and challenging to the listener. I'm not a composer who wants to be appreciated for making something so difficult that it is respected due to its not being understood. Instead, understanding can take place at many levels, as is the case in so many things in life, depending on the background of the listener. This is something that I consciously seek. Selecting works in a context like this one is a bit difficult. It could never cover the breadth of my work over many years. I've chosen for this talk 4 excerpts from works spanning over 3 decades, so 30 years. A collaboration with a video artist named Michel Jaffrenou from Paris, which is entitled Video Circus, from 1984. A performed work based on the recomposition, so compose again, of text by the 20th century writer named Gertrude Stein, and that's called Stein's Way, from 2009. A sample-based composition made prior to what I would do later called a radio series, called I Conduct Electricity, from 1996. And a recent work using samples from traditional Chinese music that was commissioned by the Music-Acoustica Festival in Beijing, entitled China Music, Old New, from 2013. So in the first piece, the theme of Circus was the motivation of the piece, although there is no narrative, there's no story. Jaffrenou created the storyboard, and we created the sound and image at the same time. The original version of this piece was for 3 performers and 26 video monitors on a stage, like a circus tent, and was a commission of the Pompidou Center in Paris. It was performed probably 100 times. But this was a commission by the Belgian television, and it's been broadcast or performed in festivals in over 80 countries. So, you know, I talked about getting 1 concert of a piece. Getting a video piece done in 80 countries is astonishing. I'm not famous because of it, but I'm happy because of it. So I guess that's good enough. So this is a small fragment from a 16-minute video piece that was made quite a while back. Now, this is very small on my computer now. Let's see if I can do it. Oh! Why is the sound not? Ah! The sound's not plugged in. Sorry. Oh, ooh. Try again. No sound. Anybody know this? We're not going to do too well. It was working before, so. Is it because maybe I have to shut down PowerPoint and open again?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. We're okay? I'll try again. Yeah, great.
Well, there's seven. Tell me all you can, boy. This is a low grade here.
I started a little late and I don't want us to have the time postponed too much. But you can hear that it's mainly me plundering samples of existing music. I mean, there's an analog synth and a few other things. But already then, I was using samples in my compositions. And although there are illusions to many things in art, in what you just saw, you don't need to know that to enjoy the piece. So this has been seen by a huge audience in the millions over the years, which in contemporary music usually doesn't reach, which is very satisfying. Okay, I'm not going to get through the full examples that I prepared for you today, but I'll just give you a taste. Stein's Way takes the Gertrude Stein texts and has them cut up and rearranged. Many composers have set her repetitive text to music, but I believe the music is already in her texts and enjoy combining the same voice on the recording with a live voice, creating a very theatrical performance of not quite coherent texts. So this piece actually lasts just over 2 minutes. I'll do just half of it. You don't even need to understand the words to enjoy it. But if you do understand the words, it's kind of about, the piece is about the piece.
Stein's Way. In case of this,
A story. Subjects and places. In place of this.
a story.
In face of this. Subjects and places. In place of this.
And
in
in
place
place
of this, a story.
A story.
When the work, when the work, and when the work, when should he work? In place of this, and in place of this.
And in place
Of this,
places,
concentrate.
if in
In
this
this way,
way,
preparations may be undertaken.
to undertake preparations.
Comparative preparations. Comparative preparations.
A considerable factor.
It is a considerable factor in this way. This is a considerable factor to
share in this.
It is
A
a
considerable factor
to have a-
share in this
another example. The time of the composition is a,
natural thing.
and the time in the composition is a
natural thing. And it is a
contemporary
contemporary
thing.
thing.
The time of the composition is the time of the composition, in part. And once again following, and once again following, and then following, and this and the sharing, and then following, and once again sharing. This is a considerable factor in this. Oops, it stopped itself. That's interesting. But that was just where I was going to quit. So this is a case of using text as sound. And the sounds are organized. Her texts are rewritten into a composition. And it takes people into another place. But I've performed this kind of piece, and others have performed this kind of piece in many countries. And they're often very well received. This next one is going to be tricky because I have to start it. Oops. I'm going to have to start it. Why is that not coming on? Oh dear. Oh, okay. is part of a full-length work of a performing arts company that I direct called Idée Fixe, Experimental Sound and Movement Theatre. Recordings were made in one evening on a single BBC station and composed into a 3-minute sequence. The first 2 minutes are to be conducted, and the last one there are dancers making a kind of a joke about the movement from the performer. After this piece was made, I've made a series of pieces based on a national broadcasting company. The last one was from the Czech Republic, and the next one is from Ireland. And it's just using samples. Most of these samples are illegal, by the way, because the legal situation with sampling is a mess. That's why sampling artists are often anonymous. When I made the one for the Czech Republic, the Czech radio has the rights to all of their recordings. Anyway, I tried to make through these sample pieces something related to the listener's experience that are entertaining, new, and politically challenging at the same time. And again, these have reached a very big audience. So I'm going to run to the music stand, and I'm going to conduct electricity.
This is Radio 4.
BBC News at
There is a madman.
More than 200 people were injured by
Chancellor Kohl's plans.
hundreds of thousands of Germans converged.
I'm frightened on my own.
Football match between Russia and Germany will keep people at home.
Rubbish!
More than 200 people were injured by President Yeltsin.
Rubbish!
More than 200 people were injured by the Northern Ireland peace talks.
And you can hear part 3 at the same time.
More than 200 people were injured by
The reindeer herders.
I shall die laughing!
What's that noise? It's a good time to check barometers before you toddle off to bed.
This damn vegetation is over head height now! Wait, there's that sound again.
the First Lady of Song.
The London fog used to be yellow before the Clean Air Act of the 60s.
I'd love to go through the whole thing because it gets funnier and sillier in time, but you got the idea. By the way, I have a baton like a conductor when I perform it. And it's just ridiculous. And then when the dancers take over, it's like a Charlie Chaplin or Woody Allen, who always make themselves look silly. Well, if I haven't succeeded in making myself silly, the dancers make me look ridiculous after that. So it's a lot of fun to do. Okay, this last one was from the commission, from the Musica Acustica Festival. So I'm not going to say that Japanese music is similar with Chinese music, but the sho and the shung, you play the same way. And so this takes traditional music, recomposes it through sampling, and I want to take something that's very old and make it sound very new. You're hearing show, but that's the show. It's 8 channels, so the sounds are all over the place, and it's like standing waves. Break it off there. And I'm going to summarize the rest because I think the time is now a problem. Obviously, people in like Europe or America are going to find this very exotic. So I think people in East Asia are going to appreciate this piece more than elsewhere. I'm aware of that. But I have performed it elsewhere, and there's been a great curiosity and interest in East Asian music because I did this. But I'm much more interested in Asian responses to this piece because it was an honor to get an Asian commission. And because I've been coming here so often, particularly to China, it was a great opportunity to say thank you and show respect to this. I haven't talked about technology other than the websites. But for this project that led to the book on analysis, we have a very fantastic analysis program called e-analysis, as in electroacoustic analysis, that was made. So again, a high-level thing, but the visualizations that come out, people that never hear this kind of music before, when they have a visualization in a visual culture, they're going to engage even better when they have something to see. So people with computer games know all about this because they're looking at stuff all the time. I'm just going to summarize the current initiatives, things that I'm involved with now. The Interfaces project has 4 million euros from the European community, and it's all about making new music for new audiences. So everything I've been talking about for 55 minutes is about that. And so we're doing educational things, we're doing cultural things, ranging from bringing music to the community, to hacking online, to sound installations, etc., to try to get more people interested. And there are 9 partners from 8 countries in this project. I'm very proud to be involved in that, which is supported by the so-called Creative Europe initiative. And John and I, and he's going to be talking about these things now, are looking at the sampling culture and the DIY or hacking culture. And our view is that in this new century, it's not about finding new sounds and it's not about finding new languages in music. It's more about how we produce things and how we distribute things. Using collaborative methods, involving participation, inclusion so anybody can be involved. And this is one of the way forward to make things accessible. So I'm not going to read that. So I have talked about myself, but that's not the goal. It's the ideas behind why I stopped being a high-level composer and why I tried to take this new music and the ideas and the technology related to this music to get more people interested. That's been a guiding force for me. And I hope that you find these decisions that I make of relevance to your own work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Because the time is almost running out.
I know.
I want to have a very short question. You introduced the being innovative and accessible. Satisfying these facts simultaneously seems very difficult, but to me it's quite successful according to your speech. But if I take each factor you introduced, it seems that we are doing nowadays. For example, collaborating with dancing, dramas, not only you, but
Of course,
many people
many
are doing, and dealing with the, say, text, poet, or non-instrumental sounds, the sonic arts. We are all doing that. Still doesn't mean we acquire a large audience. So I may say it can be a problem of advertisement or publicity, but you would say no. What's the lacking point of my view? How come you have been quite successful after speaking the review and criticism at ICMC of the technology and music independent from each other rather than having bridge to each other? I still do not get the very basic and objective idea which grasps people's mind in general. As I repeat, each factor we all do. Each factor you introduce, all of us do it. Still, we do not succeed. I'm not saying we do not succeed gaining large audience yet. But you say you're quite successful in doing that. So what's the lacking?
I got back to this slide.
Yeah.
Because in this book I said the broadcasters were a problem. The education was a problem and the communications media were a problem. But the biggest problem of all, in my opinion, and this is hard, is us the musicians. We're the problem. We make music and we expect people to get it. If we make no initiative to help people appreciate the music, so I spend more time in getting the audience to become involved with this than I spend making the music. So in the UK, where I now live and work, we speak of what we call the community music. Some countries in Europe call this animation, and I don't know what you call it in Japan. These are people who will go into schools and work with young people who don't know anything about this music. Introduce it to them and have them make it. So maybe using this new software we made. And within 3 visits, they're already making music with sounds and getting gratification and saying, Daddy, Mama, look at this, I did this. I can do it. I don't play piano and I don't play clarinet, but I can do this. With children, that's a very special case. With adults, it's harder because you already have developed your taste. But through workshops and collaboration, and John is going to show you how he does it in his workshops that are phenomenal throughout the world. The people that get introduced to this stuff are interested and they want to listen to it and they want to make it. Listening is already a success. Participating is a bigger success. Without spending time doing this, basically an artist's attitude is I make, you consume. That's the mistake. And that's what I've been doing for 30 years, is not accepting that and doing something about it. And of course the online initiatives help, because anybody can get to years 2 on the internet and they can learn about this. I'm about to get 2 European countries recommending that every school in their country uses this. If that happens, no small public in 10 years. We will win.
Okay, thank you. Are there any ladies?
So thank you very much for the very inspiring talk.
Thank you.
And I have, so in the past I also read Trevor Richard's on the Sonic Art book, and I have the impression in England or in UK, there are quite a few successful cases in that the elementary schools employ the new music thing into their curriculum, and then I wonder how it happened. Well, in Japan, like the Ministry of Education sets a curriculum,
Yes.
right? And then within that, the new music is not quite there.
It's not there in the UK either.
Yeah.
It
So
got
how
close.
did you initiate that? Like,
It got close to being there in the 1990s when Trevor was doing this
Right,
work.
right.
But it's gone downhill. However, in the curriculum for music in England, because Scotland has a different one, but that doesn't matter, there are musical concepts that need to be learned. And you can learn these concepts in electroacoustic music just the same way you can learn them in instrumental music. So it's up to the teacher or the guest who comes in, like John and me, to show them to do this. You can learn it on a noise instrument, and you can learn it on a saxophone. So this attitude, when I was in Holland, this didn't exist in Holland either, so I would ask the same question. But in the 80s going into the 90s, the UK was way ahead in addressing the question of the kids. And the result of that is that the community arts, not only music but dance and etc., is huge. You cannot get money from the Arts Council unless you are going and showing what you do to people that don't usually go to your concerts. And this is very important. So what I complained about in 91 is everybody has to do it now.
Okay. So, well, for example, in my university, like, we are highly encouraged to approach the younger generation of people,
Excellent.
like exchange with the high school students, middle school students, and even the elementary school students.
Wonderful.
Like through the attached school or like approaching the public school and so on.
And I'm also sure in Japan, if you go for a research grant in engineering, they ask you about the impact of what you're doing.
Yeah.
Well, there's only one way we're going to get impact in music, is getting people interested and involved. Otherwise, it's just blah blah about impact. You know, somebody looked at a manuscript, so what?
Yeah.
But by doing this, you're actually getting people engaged with something.
Right. And I think your point about humor is tremendously valuable. Like I think it's the only way to let people emotionally engaged and then fascinated about music, because the abstract beauty is beautiful, but it's not that emotional in a traditional sense.
Well, for 1 minute, in the early 19th century, there was a term that came from France, and I'm sure it exists in Japanese, so anybody who knows this term, please translate it for me. It was called art for art's sake.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know it in Japanese?
芸術のための芸術.
Yeah? And basically, to simplify that,
Yeah.
art left, aesthetics was in the heart, and it went into the brain. So Adorno says anybody who likes emotion in music is crazy and stupid.
Yeah.
It's all about the understanding. And I'm, you know, like a feminism is emancipation and all this. I'm emancipated too. Music is about the heart and the brain. And as long as we keep this in the equation, it's okay. If it's only that, no wonder there's no public.
Right, right.
It's easy to talk about a formalization in music, so I'm not complaining about the generative algorithm. But the whole generative algorithm only works when the musical idea is good. It won't be good by itself.
Sorry, being a session chair, I also have to control the time.
Yes, that's fine.
So I would like to, conclude this Leigh Landy session. Thank you very much. We are a bit behind the schedule, but let's have 5 minutes break.